I've seen a lot of comments where people have criticised the school and the staff for not recognising that Maddie was going through what she was going through at home. And it's understandable when something like this happens to a child, people become angry and they want to blame people. But at the end of the day, let's remember that the monster here is Stearns. The school were doing what they were capable of, to put it bluntly. Could teachers perhaps have had better training in terms of recognising signs of trauma, in terms of recognising when perhaps things should be escalated and other agencies should be involved? Perhaps they should. For me, listening to interviews of the teachers, what my impression was that they simply didn't have the knowledge. I don't know what schools are like in America, whether there is adequate professional development for staff, and whether perhaps the focus of professional development may in fact be to do with academic stuff. But it sounds to me that perhaps there needs to be more professional development offered to teachers in schools throughout America to help them to recognise signs of particular traumas that children are going through. But at the end of the day, I think presented with a child who was recognised as having ADHD, I believe that while these staff did miss a lot of red flags, that they can't be held accountable for that. And I'm going to explain that in this video. Why is it possible that Maddie's diagnosis of ADHD made it harder to see that she was struggling with PTSD? Now, just terms for people who may not know them, I presume that people know all the terms that I'm talking about, and I probably should explain. So in this video, I'm talking about ADHD, which is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Used to be called ADD. That term is no longer used. It is now referred to as ADHD. I'm also going to refer to CPTSD and PTSD. So CPTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And then PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll talk about the differences with them a little way down the track. And finally, I'm going to talk about ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder. That used to be called autism. It also used to be called Asperger's syndrome. Neither of those terms are used these days. It is now simply referred to as ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. Now, because of the multiple letters in this video, I may still switch back to talking about autism, just to make it easier for people to understand, so that people are not trying to get their heads around all the letters that come out here. So we know that we've heard that Stearns and Jen have said that Madeline was diagnosed with ADHD. And then I think it was Stearns mentioned in an interview that she more recently was diagnosed as having some symptoms of ASD, autism. Now, that is significant and interesting, but it's possible that they were not symptoms of ASD. So I'm going to start first by breaking down each one of those different diagnoses. And to help with that, I've got a few different charts that I've pulled up also, which will show you some overlaps between different diagnoses. So one chart that shows an overlap between ADHD and ASD, so an overlap between ADHD and autism, and another chart which shows the overlap between ADHD and PTSD. Because I think it is quite possible. It's a bit of a what came first, the chicken or the egg situation. Because symptoms of PTSD or CPTSD can present in the same way as ADHD symptoms or in the same way as ASD symptoms. The difference is the region of the brain that is affected and, of course, the original cause. At the same time, PTSD can lead to the onset of ADHD due to the impact on the development of the frontal cortex, or the entire brain, I gather, because of the trauma that has occurred. On the other side of things, ADHD can make a person more susceptible to PTSD, because one of the problems with ADHD is an inability to regulate emotions, or at least it becomes much harder for someone with ADHD to regulate emotions, because that is the part of the brain that is affected by ADHD. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. So let's talk about ADHD first. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is a disorder which affects the frontal lobe of the brain. So in terms of ADHD and ASD, the area of the brain that affected is the same. So I'm going to put them both together for this. So for people with ADHD and ASD, the frontal cortex is the area of the brain that is affected. This is basically the limbic region of the brain, and what it does is that it regulates behaviour, emotions and attention, in a nutshell. And what you see with people who have ADHD or autism is that that part of the brain is slightly underdeveloped. Now, I can assure you, as someone who has ADHD, that it doesn't impair intelligence. People with ADHD can still have extremely high IQs, and quite often you will see that. Not all the time. Sometimes you will come across people who have ADHD who also struggle with low intelligence, but quite often you will see people who have extremely high IQs who suffer from ADHD. So saying that it is underdeveloped, don't confuse that for that making someone dumb or not so intelligent, because that is far from the case in many, many people. What it is, however, if you look at brain scans of people who have ADHD or ASD alongside brain scans of neurotypical brains, as in the brains of people who are considered normal, and I hate using that term because I prefer to think of ADHD and autism as being just running on a different operating system. It's like running a Mac as opposed to running a PC. So I don't like the term normal or neurotypical. Maybe neurotypical because that's a step away from normal. It's saying it's typical, it's what you see in a large number of people. But at the same time, we're seeing more and more recognition of ADHD and ASD in people. So you have ASD and ADHD, which affect the limbic region, the frontal cortex of the brain. In terms of PTSD or CPTSD, the area of the brain that is affected is the temporal lobe. So that's a little bit further back. Most specifically, it's this little section inside the temporal lobe called the amygdala. And that does a similar thing, or the outcome is a similar thing. The amygdala is what controls the fight or flight responses in people. So when someone has experienced trauma, that part of the brain becomes overactive. And what happens is that the brain pretty much stays in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. It used to be just considered fight or flight, but these days they've recognised that there is also the freeze response. This is a very basic survival instinct that exists in all people. But when it comes to people with PTSD or CPTSD, this becomes so heightened that their brain is almost always in this state of fight, flight, or freeze. And this means that it does affect the other functions of the brain. And this is why it can appear that someone who suffers from PTSD is actually suffering from ADHD, because there is an overlap of symptoms that present. And I'll go through a chart with that shortly. So before I look at charts which show the overlaps between ASD, ADHD and PTSD, I do want to just explain what I'm talking about when I talk about CPTSD and PTSD. So you have complex PTSD and regular, for want of a better term, PTSD. The difference is that when you refer to PTSD, you are usually referring to a response from a single incident or a response to a singular period of time. So, for example, and this is not probably the greatest example, but just to keep it simple and easy, you may be involved in a car accident and you experience PTSD as a result of that, so that you become anxious about travelling in cars, and perhaps you become anxious about being a passenger in a vehicle because you feel like you would rather have control of the vehicle. Now, not that having a motor vehicle accident is always going to result in PTSD, but it can, depending on the extent of it. But what I'm saying here is that quite often PTSD is the result of a single event or a string of events, so a period of time but all close together, sort of like a knock-on effect. But complex PTSD is when a person is exposed to a form of trauma over a long period of time. And that can occur as a result of parental neglect or of ongoing trauma. I can't really use the correct terms here, but I'm talking about what happened to Maddie. What Stearns did occurred over several years of Maddie's life. So for her, it's not PTSD. It's not from one single incident that occurred. It's complex PTSD. It's something that she experienced regularly over many, many years. The symptoms will present the same. Complex PTSD can be a lot harder to treat, obviously, and it also can be, not always, but it can sometimes be worse than just regular PTSD because there is so many issues involved with that. So let's have a look at some charts now which show the overlaps, first of all, between ASD and ADHD, and then the overlaps between ADHD and PTSD. I'm just looking at it as PTSD because symptom-wise, like I said, PTSD and CPTSD, they still affect the exact same part of the brain. It's just a recognition of the triggers. So one is saying that it's a more singular trigger, the other is saying that it is triggered over a length of time. So let's have a look at these charts. And then I'm going to talk about what I think in terms of what Maddie was experiencing in her life. Now, before I launch into that, I am going to say that I'm more than happy for other creators to use parts of this video or all of this video, but I am going to ask one thing. That is that, first of all, that you credit my channel for this video, for this information that I'm putting out. I'm only a small channel, and I know there's a lot of quite large channels that are covering Maddie's case. And they're the channels that are getting the majority of views, of course, obviously. And because they are covering Maddie's case so thoroughly, the views don't tend to come this way that much. So if you are a creator and you are going to use my content, feel free to do so. But please credit my channel and please add a link for this video in your description, and perhaps if you could encourage people to come my way and send a bit of love my way to help me build up my view count, maybe to help me build up my subs. Just, share the love a little bit. So let's jump in and look at these charts. Now, the main purpose of sharing this particular diagram with the ADHD and ASD is to show just how much there is in terms of overlap. I'm not going to go into it in depth, so it's something that if you want to, you can do a screenshot of it and have a closer look at it yourself. I think for what we're discussing today, I don't need to go through a lengthy explanation of all the things that overlap. But one of the important things to note when it comes to both ASD and ADHD is that they are both spectrum disorders. It's only recently that there is now recognition that ADHD is also a spectrum disorder like ASD. What do I mean by a spectrum disorder? It means that the symptoms are not the same for every person. So you may have a range of ADHD symptoms. You may not have all the ADHD symptoms. And those symptoms that you do have may vary in severity. So if you picture a wheel, something like this, but this is way oversimplified, but each section of the wheel is one of the things that presents in terms of ADHD. So sensory processing, it may be like one of those things may be that you are overly sensitive to loud noises. Let's say the orange is overly sensitive to loud noises. It may be that you don't cope with really strong smells. That would be a different section. So you've got all the different things that can present as part of ADHD, and then they can present as being mild, which is where you've got that inner circle where the number 1 is. They might be kind of moderate symptoms, which is your middle circle where the number 5 is, or they might be extreme symptoms where you've got the number 10. You may have some things that are in that inner circle, some in the middle circle, some in the outer circle. And for every person, it's going to be different. And that's the same thing with ASD. So if we go back to this Venn diagram that looks at the overlaps between ADHD and autism, you can see that there are a heck of a lot of things in the middle there that can be seen as either ADHD or ASD. And then you've got the things on the outside on either side that are considered to be symptoms of only one. Now, I have to say that I don't 100% agree with this particular chart that's in front of you right now. With ADHD, over here it says craves novelty and new experiences. Yes, that can be the case, but also in order to cope for someone with ADHD, there is a need for structure and a need for familiarity. So that has been put on the other side on the autism spectrum. But managing ADHD, part of managing ADHD is creating structure and having things that are familiar. And when you step out of that zone, it can cause anxiety. So it's interesting that they do differentiate like that, because sometimes ADHD can step over that line and look a bit more like autism. Now, one thing I'm going to note is that ADHD and autism these days, you get a lot of dual diagnoses. People who have been diagnosed with ADHD and then at a later date are diagnosed as also having autism. Or people who get a diagnosis like later in life and are diagnosed as combined ADHD and autism. But I'm going to go out on a limb here And I'm going to say that I personally believe that ADHD and autism are in fact different parts of the same spectrum disorder. You have so much in common between the two. Brain scans of people with ASD and ADHD look very similar, and there also seems to be a genetic link. Quite often in families, you will have family members who are diagnosed as having autism, and other family members will be diagnosed as ADHD. So I believe that over time, as there is more research done, that there will be recognition of them being the one spectrum disorder, and that perhaps it will be given a new name that reflects that. Now, moving on to ADHD and PTSD, and I am going to highlight some of the things that are in that middle section there, because these are some of the things that have been reported for Maddie. Now, we know that she was medicated a lot of the time, and the medication will affect how these symptoms present. But if we listen to the interviews of her friends and listen to what they say for when she was not medicated, then this certainly raises questions for me. So in the middle here, things that could be either ADHD or PTSD: irritability and restlessness, impulse control difficulties, working memory impacted. Okay, you've got increased risk of victimisation, but that doesn't necessarily apply for Maddie. Attention, concentration and memory issues, forgetfulness, distractibility, heightened sensitivities to sensory input, sleep irregularities, executive functioning disabilities, emotional regulation difficulties, task switching difficulties. These are all things that have been put forward as problems that Maddie struggled with. And when you listen to her teachers talking about how she was struggling at school, the things they are talking about, you could put them here in this middle section. And these teachers are presented with a child who is diagnosed as having ADHD and is also being medicated for it a lot of the time. Now, the thing with ADHD medications is that if you don't get them right, then you will see some kids who, when they're on their ADHD meds, will come to school and pretty much fall asleep because the meds aren't properly regulated. So where Maddie's teacher is talking about how she switched into the period 6 for the day and how she was performing even worse at the end of the day than earlier on in the day. This is a teacher with 13 years teaching experience, so she's probably recognising what she's seen in other students in the past with ADHD. That as the day wears on, they struggle even more to maintain attention and to stay focused and to stay on track. She speaks about Maddie having trouble getting assignments in. That could be something that could be seen as ADHD problems. Or it could be PTSD. So while there are things, and I'm going to go through the interviews with the teachers, because I think there are some interesting things that I would like to point out. And there are definitely red flags there that perhaps a teacher with more understanding of PTSD may have gone, hang on, no, I don't think this is ADHD. I don't think this is because of her ADHD. I think there's something more going on here. But it is easy to blur the lines and think, okay, well, these things that she does are classic ADHD symptoms. So what I'm saying is more that instead of stopping to question the behaviours and really analysing the behaviours, the teachers were simply accepting the behaviours as ADHD and not questioning it any further. I think for teachers that is a failing, but if they haven't been given the training to recognise the difference, they can't be blamed for that. Now, talking about the discussion of how Maddie was diagnosed with ADHD, and that more recently they were suggesting that there were also symptoms of ASD. That's also significant. So many factors can affect the symptoms of ADHD. Maddie was at the age when she was going through puberty, which means that her ADHD symptoms could have been exacerbated. Usually when a child goes through puberty, their symptoms of ADHD are exacerbated because of all the crazy hormonal crap that's going on. But PTSD can also exacerbate ADHD symptoms because of the stress of the situation. So I find it concerning that it's just been said, well, she's shown a few symptoms of ASD, but it doesn't sound like anyone's actually stopped to delve further into it and to question if it is ASD, or to have a really close look at what's going on overall for Maddie in terms of mental health, physical health, all those sorts of things. I think in terms of specialists, there needs to be more time put into these kind of diagnoses, because it's quite possible too that what they were saying were symptoms of ASD that were presenting. Like I said, that it could be her ADHD was spiking and appearing to be worse and she was struggling more, or it could be that those symptoms that they referred to as ASD symptoms were in fact complex PTSD. So this comes to the question, which comes first? Now, there's a little bit of vagueness about when Maddie was diagnosed with ADHD. It is possible that she was diagnosed with ADHD before Stearns came onto the scene. But there is now an account from Jen's ex-husband about I think it was 2 years when he was married to Jen. And it sounds like Maddie has never had a stable home life. That sort of thing can lead to complex PTSD. So it's possible that even from an early age, that this child has been subjected to things that have caused complex PTSD, and that this has then become exacerbated when Stearns came on the scene. It is, of course, also possible that she has had ADHD from day one, and that has been exacerbated by PTSD. So I hope I haven't lost people here with trying to explain all this. But what I'm trying to say here is that you can't be 100% certain that all these problems that Maddie was having at school were ADHD. You also can't be 100% certain that these problems were PTSD. Many of these teachers and the counsellor were only seeing Maddie maybe once a day at most. They weren't core teachers who had her for 5 hours a day. So it would have been harder if you're teaching a child for 1 hour a day. You don't build up a relationship with that child. You don't have time to learn to really understand what's going on with that child. And if you're teaching particular classes, if you're in a role where you have 5 or 6 different classes a day, then you're working with over 100 kids a day perhaps. As a counsellor, if this counsellor, as I said, was only catching up with Maddie once a month, they didn't know Maddie. So they were, in their opinion, dealing with a child who was struggling with ADHD, who wasn't properly medicated, by the sounds of it, and who was just struggling with school in general because of her ADHD. None of these teachers had enough time with Maddie to really build up enough of an understanding of this child. This was only the first year that they had come across her. So even though it's easy for us to stand back and do the Monday morning quarterback thing, at the end of the day, when you're there at the coalface, it's much harder to tell if this child that is having so much difficulties in your class is in fact simply a child who is really struggling with ADHD, or if there's something else going on. Now, I will talk about the things that I believe should have been in place at that school, things that I believe should have occurred at that school in another video. But I did want to, in this video, just address the issue of the challenges if you are not skilled, if you don't have the training, and in particular, if you don't know the child well, of differentiating between ADHD, autism, and PTSD, because there is so much overlap. And if a child is not disclosing anything that would lead you to believe that there is something going wrong at home, then it is possible to make the mistake and believe that that child is simply struggling with ADHD and nothing more. I hope this hasn't been too confusing for people. I hope this has led to perhaps a few thoughts on whether or not we are being a bit harsh on the school And perhaps it has given some clarity as to why it got missed for so long that Maddie was going through hell, and it seems like people just didn't figure it out. So thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe, please hit the like button, and definitely leave a comment below. What do you think about what I've discussed in this video today?